Welcome everyone to our Lunch and Learn today, Best Practices in Medical Device Software and Firmware Design. My name is Renee Miller. I am the Program Manager at the Oregon Bioscience Incubator, and we really appreciate you all being here today for this Lunch and Learn. So as a housekeeping item, if you would please put your microphones on mute, that would be helpful. And we can just go ahead and get started today. Our program is sponsored and presented by Simplexity. We have two speakers today. The first one is Katie Elliott. She's an expert firmware engineer at Simplexity Product Development. She holds a bachelor's and master's degree in electrical engineering from the University of Washington and is a US patent holder with over 20 years of product and embedded systems development experience. Her expertise includes embedded software, digital signal processing, real-time systems, wearable devices, and developing firmware for medical devices. And our other speaker from Simplexity is Dorota Shortell. She's the CEO and Simplexity is an engineering design firm specializing in the design of hardware such as wearables, medical devices, connected consumer products, diagnostic instruments, and commercial equipment. Dorota has a bachelor's in mechanical engineering from Loyola Marymount University and a master's degree in mechanical engineering from Stanford. She is a US patent holder and has over 20 years of new product development experience. Her career has progressed from engineer to project manager and director until she took over as CEO of Simplexity in 2010. She has also been recognized by the Portland Business Journal as a 40 under 40 winner and executive to watch. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our speakers. I believe Katie is up first. If you are ready, please go right on ahead and take it away.
Okay, just to add on to that a little bit. So I'm Katie, and I've been working specifically in product development consulting for the past 10 years. And during the past couple of years, I've been a big part of the initiative at Simplexity to implement a quality management system and get our ISO 13485 certification. So that's why I'm here to talk about software process.
All right, and I'm Dorota. Thanks for the introduction, Renee. And so I'm here to help with the presentation. Katie's going to dive into most of the details and the nitty-gritty behind software firmware. She's the firmware engineer and the quality lead. But in terms of overall process at Simplexity, or overall process in any medical device product firm or product development firm, I can answer those questions. And so in terms of the agenda of what we're going to cover today, the first section, we're going to talk about the motivation or the why. Why are we talking about software process? Why is it important? How does it affect things? And in implementing best practices, the process really is a very important piece of it in order to get a quality product at the end of it. We'll talk about the overall phase-based device and software development processes. We'll use our Simplexity process as an example, and then Katie will walk through all the details of what's done at every phase. After that, we do have a couple case studies because people are always interested in what are the products that this could be applied to. So we have a couple case study slides, and then we'll summarize the best practices. And then hopefully at the end, we've got some time for Q&A. So if you've got questions and answers, you can either put them into the chat as we talk. So if there are things that are clarifications on some of the things we're covering, feel free to put those in the chat as we go along. I'll be monitoring those since Katie will be presenting most of the content. And then if it's other general type questions and not specifically to the content or about products you're developing or something like that, we'd be happy to take those at the end. We should have time for that.
Okay. So for me, one of the most powerful motivators for following a good software design process are examples where software has failed. And one really big example is in 2013, Toyota faced a lawsuit for their unintended acceleration problem, which is where the cars wouldn't stop accelerating and several people were killed because of this. And so an Oklahoma jury determined that Toyota had acted with reckless disregard and delivered a $3 million verdict to the plaintiffs. Toyota quickly settled before the jury could determine punitive damages, because what the jury heard that constituted just gross neglect by Toyota was the testimony of 2 experts in software design and the design process. And both experts concluded that the software control system that controlled the acceleration was defective and dangerous. It was riddled with bugs, with large gaps in its fail-safes that led to the root cause of the crash. They spent 18 months analyzing the source code, and they found a lot of different problems in the source code, such as places where memory would be corrupted, thousands of global variables, which is a big no-no in software. And both experts, as well as even an internal Toyota email, described the code as spaghetti code, which is basically how you insult someone's code that is overly complex, untestable, and even just unmaintainable, where making a simple change will cause more bugs. Besides just poor code, they also failed because of inadequate software engineering process. So they didn't use any of the automotive software reliability coding standards, and even Toyota's internal standard, which didn't have much overlap with the industry standard. Programmers broke those rules without any justification or documentation. And one of the big standards that they broke was in allowing single point failures within the system. And so this is where you would have a single piece of hardware or software that has complete control over whether the system is safe or not. One example would be a single engine airplane, for instance. So these experts testified that if safety isn't baked into the design up front during creation of the product, it can't just be added later. So you need to consider it while doing architecture and design of the system. And that's where process can help you do that. And the final kind of stopgap for process is that they didn't do any peer or code reviews for someone to actually enforce any of these standards. It did actually make me pretty nervous about my own Toyotas sitting in my garage, but I'm not driving anywhere, so I guess I'll live with it. So in medical devices, the failures are not as likely to be on the front page of the news, and they're usually not quite as spectacular, badly spectacular, like Boeing's recent failures or Toyota. But we can see failures when we look at software recalls, which are publicly available on the FDA's website. And so I just went through and looked for a few at their 2019 recalls, and highlighted a few examples that were caused by software. So the first is from Smiths Medical. They make syringe pumps that are used in neonatal and pediatric populations, as well as for adults in intensive care and operating rooms. And this was a new issue because of a firmware update, which is something also to highlight that you need to kind of have extra care when you're doing an upgrade to software firmware that's out there in the field. And the issue was that potentially low battery alarms would stop working, so that the operators wouldn't know that the battery was shutting down the device, and that therefore the infusion or the therapy was not being done. So there were no deaths or injuries, but there were complaints leading to this recall. Zimmer Biomet has a robotic surgery system that assists neurosurgeons in positioning medical instruments or implants during surgery. And this was a software issue that incorrectly positioned the robotic arm, causing risk of patient injury. A few complaints, but no deaths. Medtronic recalled some remote controllers for their insulin pumps, and these remote controllers would communicate wirelessly with the insulin pump to deliver a specific amount of insulin. And this was recalled due to a potential cybersecurity risk, where an unauthorized person could potentially record the wireless communications between the remote and the pump, and then either over-deliver or under-deliver insulin to the patient. Even though there were no reports of patient harm, it does highlight that even in embedded systems, which are things like fitness trackers or insulin pumps, we really need to start thinking more about cybersecurity risk, especially if there's wireless communication. So the number of recalls have significantly increased in recent years, with software being the largest driver of recalls. And let's see if it let me point. So on the left, we are starting with year like 2015, and you can see that by the end in 2019, the number of recalls, which is what this graph is showing, has increased significantly. And in my opinion, this isn't to say that we're having a problem in the medical device industry with the quality of medical devices, but rather I think it's a reflection of the increased complexity of devices and the software that runs on them. So it makes it all the more important to have a strong software development process in place and not just do the bare minimum to meet regulatory standards. Because of the inherent complexity in software, there are extra standards actually that software must adhere to. So under ISO 13485, which is the standard that specifies the quality management system for medical devices, software must also satisfy IEC 62304. The terminology and classifications are slightly different in the FDA world, but they also have more detailed requirements for software. So much of the processes and some of the terminology in this talk derives from IEC 62304, because that's what our quality system adheres to since we're ISO 13485 certified. So Dorota is going to talk a little bit about kind of general product development phases, specifically for Simplexity.
Right, so this is a view of our product development process in an infographic. This is available on our website, and we'll be sending these slides out, so you don't have to furiously take notes on this. But to describe the diagram, you can see that there are phases, and that's what we mean by a phase gate development process, meaning that at each phase there's a gate that we have to pass in order to move to the next phase. So you can see on the left, it starts with phase 0. That's more of an exploration phase, and that, according to our process, is the only one that is not controlled in the ISO 13485 system when we created a design history file. That is an early phase that's really just trying to figure out, hey, is this product even feasible? And so we are not controlling it in the same way as the other phases. Once we decide, and the client, that yes, this is a feasible product, then we move into phase 1, which is the requirements and planning phase of the process. And from there on, we manage that for our medical device clients in the quality system. And then we go through detailed design, which is phase 2. And then phase 3 is the design verification, design transfer. Detailed design is by far the longest part of the phase and has sub-phases, which we have as 2A, 2B, and 2C, and sometimes even 2D, depending on the complexity of the product that we're designing. And then we usually do a handoff to production after phase 3. And then if you are a medical device company yourself, after production, you're still doing maintenance of the product and so forth and upgrades. But Simplexity's involvement usually ends once we have a very clear manufactured product. And then you can see on the diagram as well, the top blue line that is design and engineering, and the bottom orange is new product introduction. So we do those two activities in parallel. The design and engineering side is more of what we're going to be talking about here in this talk, which is the software firmware, but of course there's also other aspects of design and engineering, such as mechanical engineering and electrical and all the other aspects. And then the new product introduction part of that is looking at, in parallel with the design, how is this product going to get to manufacturing and how is it going to go to production? And so we also offer that in that kind of orange view, and you can see the curves of where the work really picks up towards the end of phase 2 detailed design. But it does start early on, because just like with anything, you want to make sure that you're planning ahead for manufacturing and not doing that too late. So that's the description of the overall process that we follow in our phase gate process. And then as a medical device company, if you are one, you can follow your own process. The key is just to have a process and to make sure that you have it written down and that you can follow that. And so that when you do have to report everything to the FDA, that it's very clear what you did when, and the check boxes for everything that needed to happen at each point.
All right, thanks. So as Dorota mentioned, we start the product development process, the part that's in the quality system. We start with planning. And the plan is documented in the project development plan and the software development plan. And different companies call these different things. So throughout this, when I talk about the name of a document, this is just what we happen to call it. But the idea is that you have one plan that's for the overall project, and it describes the overall product development, including a high-level schedule, a description of the planned phases, outlines the technical and documentation deliverables. And then you would also have a software development plan that outlines those specifics for software. So for example, at this time is when you plan what is the software lifecycle model going to be for this project. Will the team use Agile with sprints and stand-up meetings, or waterfall with a strict adherence to a sequential plan, or something in between, such as an incremental model where the software is designed and implemented in incremental chunks? And the standards don't specify which one to use. You just have to identify which one you're using and then follow through with that. In addition, in the software development plan, you'll identify milestones and outline which features belong in those milestones. The product development and software development plans are living documents. And by the end of the project, though, they should match the reality of what actually happened. Product requirements document takes the high-level user requirements, which maybe came from the marketing department, or in the case of consulting, they came from the client. So you take those user requirements and turn them into specific technical requirements that the engineering team can use to design the product. And the software requirements specification derives from that higher level product requirements and specifies the functions and capabilities of the software, also requirements related to security, usability, and also importantly, risk control measures. All of these requirements and specifications should be written so that they are testable, unique, and that they cover only one thing per requirement. During the architecture phase, we create an architectural explanation of the software structure that will satisfy the requirements. So this is the phase where we make some big decisions that affect software, such as what processor to use, how much memory is needed, battery and power constraints, if you need sensors. You also need to choose an operating system if you're going to use one, and the programming language, and what tools you're going to use in software development. A lot of the architecture, though, is determined on paper. So it's where you come up with a lot of diagrams to describe your system. So there's a lot of different types of helpful diagrams, such as the one shown above my head or here on the right, which is showing the interface between the physical hardware and the software. Where does the software end and what is it connected to? It's also common to include diagrams that show different layers of software with the names of different modules that you're planning to implement, class diagrams, sequence diagrams. We also need to document and describe the interfaces between software and internal or external components. For example, an interface description of the commands used between an external mobile application and the firmware on a sensor would be documented at this time. Not every single detail has to be worked out, but at a high level, you should know how those things are going to communicate. In the language of IEC 62304, we can describe the software with three terms. At the top level, we have the software system, which is composed of one or more software items. And a software item is just any identifiable part of the program, and that in turn is then composed of one or more units. A software unit is the lowest level that we don't decompose it anymore. but it can get a little confusing because a lot of times in the software industry, we talk about unit testing and we're talking about function level kind of testing. But for medical devices, the software unit doesn't have to be down at that level. You want to think about what is sort of a logical unit, and also know that it will be, depending on your classification, it could be required to do software unit testing. So you want that level, you want to pick a level that's appropriate for doing that type of testing. And these terms I'm going to use later, so keep those in mind. We also, in phase 2A, perform the initial risk analysis. But before I cover those in details, I just want to give a little background on how we classify devices, medical devices. Eventually, FDA and ISO 13485 are going to become harmonized, and I hope that we will then have more consistent terminology. But for now, they're not quite merged, so I'll just showing them both. But in both cases, class 1 is the lowest risk classification, and that's things like Band-Aids, IV stands, glasses, stethoscopes, crutches. But in class 2, which is moderate risk, FDA just has one giant bucket for everything from syringes to powered wheelchairs. But in ISO 13485, they split it into 2 chunks. So we have 2A, which is kind of low to medium risk, where we have syringes, hearing aids, ultrasound. But in class 2B is medium to high risk, so things that are a little more difficult, like surgical layers or defibrillators. Both of them have class 3 as the highest risk, and this is where people are really, where safety is especially critical. So this is where a lot of implantables are, such as heart valves, implantable stimulators, breast implants, catheters, hip implants. I think a lot of life-sustaining devices would show up in this category. But once you have classified your device, software is actually classified separately. And this is the classification that drives this kind of level of rigor needed in software. So in the FDA, they call these levels of concern. And minor level of concern is where a failure in software is unlikely to cause injury to a patient or operator. Moderate is where failures could directly result in a minor injury. And major is where death or serious injury could happen. And kind of in parallel, IEC 62304, we have class A that can't contribute at all to a hazardous situation causing harm. And a hazardous situation is a circumstance that exposes a person to a hazard that could cause harm. In class B, the resulting harm would be that the software can contribute to a hazardous situation, and that resulting harm could be a non-serious injury. But in class C, that harm could be death or serious injury. And so you have to be much more rigorous with the whole process. So a risk analysis, risk is the combination of the probability of occurrence and the severity of harm. So you're asking, how often does a failure happen, and then how serious are the consequences when it does? So there's many different tools for doing risk analysis, but 2 of the most well-known ones are a hazard analysis, which is a top-down approach, and a failure modes and effect analysis, or FMEA, which is a bottoms-up approach. In a hazard analysis, you would start by identifying the hazards, kind of the top level. What are the sources of harm? And then you would take those and define a hazardous situation where you expose someone to potential harm, and what is the associated harm. And then from there, you can estimate the risk of that harm. In an FMEA, on the other hand, you start with your design. So you identify in your design where the failures could occur. And then you list what are the effects of each failures And then you take that and estimate risk. One thing to note is that a hazard analysis is required by the regulations, whereas FMEA is not. The critical piece that's missing from an FMEA, but is present in the hazard analysis, is identifying the hazards and the harm. The FMEA is identifying those failures modes and calculates the risks slightly differently. But in medical devices, risks are not solely a function of failures. For example, an FMEA can't find missing things in your design because you've started already with the design. So FMEA is better as a reliability tool than as a purely risk management tool. However, it is a useful tool and can be very effective when used together with a hazard analysis. So a risk level table, which I have an example shown here, combines the probability of occurrence of harm with the severity harm to estimate the level of risk. So this table will be customized for our particular products, but they would look pretty similar. And so in red, with the R3, we have unacceptable risk, and further action is required to eliminate and continue to lower the risk as far as possible. And yellow also requires further action. It's unacceptable, but residual risks that still remain in this region, in that case, you would do a risk-benefit analysis without considering economics and conduct that for each risk to show that the benefits outweigh the risk. The R1 boxes in green are acceptable risk and no further action is needed. And the primary reason that this effort is begun in the architecture phase is to ensure that you have an architecture that can adequately address the risks identified. And this is where Toyota made a mistake by not identifying those risks early and taking them into account while designing the product. And it's important to have a product development because it forces the team to do this. So specifically for software, recall that in the architecture, we defined software items. So during the software risk analysis, we would identify and list any of those items that could contribute to a hazardous situation. This is usually involves a giant spreadsheet, either as part of the systems hazard analysis or a separate spreadsheet. And then you would identify the causes of those items contributing to a hazardous situation. So this could be a software bug that fails to sound an alarm, or missing a specification that where no alarm was required. It could be that how the software reacts to a hardware failure. If you lost connection to a sensor, for example, does the software crash, or does it put itself in a safe state? And what does a safe state even mean for your system? So once we've identified those hazardous situations, if the risk is too high, as defined on that table, we would define a risk control measure. And those could be implemented in hardware, software, the working environment, or user instructions. And that's kind of a priority risk of where it is best to implement the risk control measure. It's obviously much safer to have a user prevented by the hardware from doing something that could lead to harm, as opposed to an instruction that warns them not to. One thing that's critical is that if a risk control measure is in the software, that you add it to the software requirements specification. There has to be a requirement so that you don't lose track of these risk control measures. So during detail design, which is the largest of the product development phases, we'll flesh out the details of the architecture from phase 2A. So we take those high-level software items, break them into units, and design and document enough detail to allow implementation. Before implementing the code, a formal design review must be held and documented. One note is that it's not necessary to complete the design of every single software item or module before proceeding to implementation. In the incremental software lifecycle model, for example, you would design a feature, review the feature, implement the feature, test the feature. And that also allows us to break up the work between multiple engineers and work in parallel. So unit implementation and testing is where we finally get to write some code, which is actually a fairly small part of the software development process. So you would take your designs, write them in code, and then you would create runnable binaries for tests. It's industry standard to use source code control from the very start of a project. It's not strictly required by the regulations until verification, but we always start it right at the beginning. It's also important that code reviews be built into the process, and most source code control systems now do provide a gate where the code can't be integrated into the main line of code until the code review has been completed and approved. And here I also want to highlight the importance of reviews in the design and of the design and the code, which happens all during this phase. So I consider these reviews kind of the enforcement arm of the design process. So design reviews force an engineer to capture the design and present it to other engineers. And that activity in itself causes you to reflect on what you've done and think about the design. And sometimes you even find issues by yourself before presenting it to others. And the feedback also from engineering peers all is an important part in helping you catch design flaws and ensuring proper risk mitigations have been considered. At the time you're doing it, it can feel really cumbersome. You're usually up against some deadline. You have to give the reviewers, a few days to review it, and you're supposed to be done. It's a pause in activity. But even though it feels inefficient, it's far cheaper and more efficient to find an issue in the design before the code has been written or before a board has been manufactured than compared to finding a bug during testing or worse, missing a bug that causes a recall or injury or even death. So it's very helpful to do that even for non-medical devices. And code reviews are the second fail-safe, where you enforce coding standards, find bugs, and give feedback on the code. And this also ties back to Toyota's software failures. The fact that the code didn't follow Toyota's own coding standards, which usually do help improve bugs. These coding standards are important. That could have been caught and fixed during the code review process, and it would have reduced the likelihood of defects. So as the software engineers implement each test and test each unit, those units are integrated into larger and larger subsystems, which must be tested further. And you have to make sure that they interact well together. It's important to automate as much testing as possible, and if you can, into your build system, so that testing can happen without engineers having to actually doing anything. You tend to do it more often, and it can highlight regressions earlier, which makes them easier to find. During the design phases, it's actually a little more difficult to align software and hardware development. Hardware typically follows a design, build, test strategy, with the project phases like phase 2B and 2C. Those are aligning with hardware builds. But software development really has no need for an artificial boundary between the hardware builds. Yet at the same time, hardware and software are intertwined. The hardware has to be tested using functional software or firmware. So one effective strategy is to determine what software features are necessary to verify the hardware. And completion of those features can serve as a milestone, which you would have outlined in the software development plan for the earlier phases. By the end of the final design, build, test phase, though, the software must be feature complete and tested. In phase 3, the team's focus turns away from development and towards verification. The software system verification test protocols would have been released at the end of phase 2, typically written by the quality engineer with input from the software engineers, or possibly even more collaboratively. And the team will execute dry runs and fix final issues with the software or the protocols themselves. Hopefully, before you run formal software verification, you have pretty high confidence that your software is going to pass. Before that formal verification begins, the software team has to prepare a candidate release build. This will include release notes with a list of known issues a list of what features are included and any bugs that have been fixed in this version compared to the previous version, if there was one. This software build is a version that will be used for the formal software verification testing. We sometimes casually refer to this as released software or doing the software release, but it's not officially released until it is actually passed that verification testing. That's a big gate. And for this formal verification, it's important also to have independence of the tester. So that tester shouldn't be one of the engineers that did the design or implementation of the software. And any issues or bugs found during this testing in this whole phase will be documented in the issue tracking system and will be evaluated by the project team for how to address it. And then finally, you're ready to do that formal verification of the software, which happens along with the overall design verification testing for the product as a whole. And at this point, the product, to gloss over a few MPI details, the product is ready for transfer to manufacturing. And so we have a few case studies for you.
All right, and I'll jump in here a little bit. So this is a product that we're currently working on. The client is Stereo-Free Medical. They have a website, so this is announced on the last slide. We'll give you all the links to those as well if you want to look them up. But what they have is, this is a point of care disinfection system for mostly hospitals, clinics, long-term care facilities, although the applications can go beyond that as well. So right now, let's say you're a doctor and you use a stethoscope, or the nurse puts a blood pressure cuff on someone. The current standard is disinfecting sprays and wipes, and there's a lot of problems, and there's a lot on their website as to what the problems are with that in terms of chemical exposure, you know, how well something is wiped, is it really disinfected, and so forth. And so they've developed this device called Aura, which is a box that's mounted on the wall, and then the medical personnel can put the stethoscope or other items, even electronics, into the device, and it disinfects it. And what's unique about Aura is that it doesn't use UV, which is a point of sight. So with UV, it only would disinfect the area that the UV can see. This uses a hydrogen peroxide and ozone combination, their proprietary system, to encompass whatever is inside the box and disinfect it. And so we are working on the redesign of this product for them for cost reduction, reliability, getting it off to manufacturing, also Simplexity, we simplify things. So trying to simplify it and make it as lightweight, as quiet as possible. And what's interesting about this one is this is actually going to be registered with the EPA, not the FDA, based on the requirements for this product, but we are still following the same best practices and product development standards that we would be if it were FDA instead of EPA. Although there are a few differences that I'm probably not the best one to get into, but the idea is the same process is followed on the design and development of this product. And this is an embedded firmware project. So basically this device is not connected, and we don't have a whole layer of software, which sometimes we have on products. Basically it's a standalone unit. And so the firmware development on this is looking at, how all the different aspects are controlled, monitoring door switches and sensors, looking at the screen, what's displayed to the user, looking at how much hydrogen peroxide is left in the unit and having indicators and so forth. And all of that is displayed on the screen. So the user puts the items in, closes the door, presses the button, and the system starts up. And so that's all contained, and we're working on, again, what are all the possible errors and how do we fail safe this product. And then we'll talk about one more, and then at the end, again, we can get into Q&A on these. And this is another project we're working on for Emerge Diagnostics. And they have what's called an electrodiagnostic functional assessment, EFA test. And like, for example, one of the applications is, let's say, long haul truck drivers. Sometimes they unfortunately are in accidents and have to go through physical therapy to get back to the range of motion. And what this product allows people to do is, when the company hires the driver, they can put the sensors on the soft tissue to evaluate what their kind of baseline range of motion is and strength and so forth, so that when they go through the process of healing and recovery, they can go to their own baseline versus just a random or some sort of an arbitrary baseline. And so we're working on the development, and Katie is the lead engineer on this project, so maybe she can jump in and talk about other work that we're doing in helping this client.
Yeah, this one is kind of near and dear to my heart. So Simplexity's role has been on the sensor side with the sensors in the charger. And in this picture, you can see kind of the older version. So we're working on a refresh, a newer version. And so it's actually kind of fun for us at Simplexity to have a project that involves all the disciplines. And so we've had mechanical, electrical, firmware, and quality engineering, as well as project management and MPI. And so we evaluate, there's several different types of sensors. And in the firmware side, we basically collect that data and send it streaming wirelessly to the PC application, which we did not have a role in, and which is where things are analyzed. And we started this project all the way at exploration and are continuing to work on it today. So we have also been active on all the documentation, starting with phase 1, including process documentation, such as development plan, requirements, architecture. We're doing both a hazard analysis and FMEA, as well as, of course, design and code reviews and testing. So let's see. I forgot to put myself. So to kind of summarize and pull everything together in one slide, which requires, of course, glossing over lots of details, but some of the most important things to take away from this and that we want to emphasize is that it's really critical to use a phase gate development process. You need to have a phase where you're creating that plan, and the team is focused on that and defining requirements. You need to develop that architecture with thinking about the risks involved. And you have a phase for detailed design and implementation, as well as for verification and validation. You want to design these specifications so that they are testable and that they include your risk controls that you decided on. And you need to do that software risk analysis along with your hazard analysis during the architecture phase to identify those risk controls early and make sure that safety is baked into the design. You want to use design and code reviews to enforce company or industry design and coding standards, and test early, test often, automate as much as possible, and finish off the product development effort with a successful software verification. So I think at this point we are ready to turn it over for questions and have a discussion. And here's some resources, links to the 2 companies we mentioned, as well as some articles used in the data that we presented as well.
And we'll be sending this. I think Renee will send this afterward. So yeah, so feel free to unmute yourself. It's probably easiest in terms of asking a question, or if for some reason that's harder for you, you can also put anything in the chat.
Well, thank you so much, Dorota and Katie. You did an excellent job on this presentation, and it was chock full of really good information. Anyone attending, if you have a question, go ahead and open up your microphone and just ask your question. We will be sending out a copy of the slides tomorrow, along with the recording of the presentation today. And while we wait for any questions, I'm going to put up a quick poll. If everybody could please fill out this anonymous poll. It is just to get feedback for the OBI, for our programs in general, and this one specifically. So we appreciate you filling this out. And we'll leave that up on the screen for a couple of minutes. And again, if anybody has any questions for the speakers, just go ahead and unmute yourself.
This is Dawn Flackney. I was wondering if you have experience with Class C software developing it, and also experiences with incorporating soup into that process?
Yeah, so I personally have not done any Class C medical devices. I've kind of seen it peripherally at a previous company. But soup is something that, even for non-class 3, you have to think about. And so I guess, are you asking kind of like, how do you address risks in soup? Or?
Yes.
Okay, I think, so one strategy that I think is effective is to sort of treat soup each different, and soup is software of unknown provenance. So that's like third-party software. And so you would treat that as a software item. And so then you would also do the risk analysis looking at that specifically, which then corresponds to any risk control measures you need to put in place. I typically haven't seen that you would necessarily do the extensive unit testing in soup, but you would maybe have testing around risk controls that you're doing for that, and you're going to need some basic testing. It also, just because of that, it sometimes might drive you to not use an operating system, for instance, which that OS is soup. That will only apply for smaller embedded devices, but that is something you have to be more careful with in Class C software. I don't know, did that answer your question, sort of?
Yes, thank you.
It looks like there's a question in the chat from Gordon. There will be product upgrades and other changes after a product is released. Do you stay involved, or do you train the customer to properly follow your protocols in the upgrading process?
Yeah, so typically what we focus on at Simplexity is the product development process. But of course, we would work together with the client, and we would be willing to consult on certain maintenance activities as well. There's certain things, though, that we can't do. We are not registered as the medical device manufacturer, as our clients are. So, for instance, any complaints about the device would come to the client, not us. However, if there's an engineering change needed to react to that, we could be consulted to do that type of activity.
Okay, and did that answer the question? I see there's another follow-up question on soup as well. So Gordon, was that everything that you were asking for? I don't know if you're able to speak on live or not.
Huh.
Oh.
Yeah, I think so. It's just a lot of small startups don't have the process control of the people, and they don't have quality groups. They need to quickly. And so training from you might be very valuable to them. And I don't know if you do that kind of thing, but
yeah, I mean, some things certainly, like as part of the software development plan, for instance, you actually need to also have a software maintenance plan.
Right.
And that is something that we could work with the client to flesh out. Often we kind of just say, oh, the client will take care of this. We are not responsible for it. And we can do that for clients that needed it. We don't exactly do like training sessions typically, but we work closely with clients on what they need. So all of our clients are pretty different. And so we just try to customize our services to what they need.
Right, and typically if they're working with us on the development side, they're learning by going through the engineering part, that by the time the product's released, they've at least gotten a lot more up to speed and trained on how to, work within a quality system. Then we can help them out. Right.
that's great. I appreciate it. I've run several software companies, and the quality issue and release issues were always major. And we hired some great people to handle that. And that was our first hires in our software companies.
Right.
Quality people and
Yeah.
the architects.
Yeah, it helps.
So thank you. It's a great process.
All right, and then Rich had a follow-up question on soup here, Katie. It says,
Yeah.
would the product manufacturer have to control the soup software version and not allow automatic updates? How about
Yeah, actually, that is something you do have to consider. So you do want to control the software versions because you want to do testing with those versions before you release it. So you typically don't want automatic updates of soup. I could imagine there could be edge cases that I'm not thinking of. But not only do you need to control it, but you need to monitor it to ensure that you stay up to date. So if there's a new release, you have to decide and document that you have chosen or not chosen to incorporate that release into your system. So that it would also be part of the software maintenance process.
Okay. And then we have another question that goes back to the risk chart. And I don't know, Katie, maybe you can flip back to that even.
Yes. So it says, with reference to the risk table, can you expand how you determine the probability of occurrence for software faults? And actually, risk or the probability of occurrence for software is kind of interesting because a lot of times what you do is, I think you put it that as 100%, that it just 100% frequency. So because in software, if it can happen, it will eventually. And so you do treat it slightly differently than like a hardware type of thing. I don't know if that fully answers your question.
Yeah, Randy, I don't know if you were able to unmute or if you want to follow up on that, if that answers it. I guess that's a question of, yeah, it's the difference between software and hardware faults. I guess my follow-up to you, Katie, would be then, how do you do it for hardware? If for software, you just say, okay, it's likely to happen, so we put it at 100% as a safety. What would you do on hardware where it's not going to be a?
Yeah, I think you would you would have to do some analysis perhaps to determine that, and it would be pretty specific to your design to decide that frequency. And it's actually, I think it's a little bit of an art. It's not always that easy to do. So that's something you have to be careful of.
Right. Okay. It looked like, yeah, they both said thanks. So I think that answers those questions.
Okay, any other questions from any? Oh, here we have another one.
Oh, risk analysis come down to engineering judgment. Yeah, I think there are a lot of aspects that can come down to engineering judgment, but I think the point is to make it so that it's a kind of a framework for writing it down and thinking about the problem, so that it's not just a gut feel, but that you're putting some strategy and analysis behind it. You may, I mean, I hope your probability of occurrence is not purely a gut feel, but at least even if that is, your calculation then of the severity of harm and how that affects risk would not be a gut feel. That would actually be something that's calculated and analyzed.
And then in terms of that risk chart, since that gets documented, I guess even if it was an educated engineering judgment, at least then there's something to go back to, right, Katie? I mean, that's kind of
how you came across that.
Yeah.
And the key in medical devices also is if it's not documented, it didn't actually happen as far as auditors are concerned. So, and also even you won't remember yourself later if you didn't document it. So it's important to get that somewhere formally written down.
Good point. Any other questions? We've got a few more minutes left. So if anyone has any questions. We have one from Rich in the chat.
Yeah, so that chat says management should always sign off on development documents and especially risk documents. Yeah, I think in our process, at least, the project manager will always sign off on these documents, especially risk, and quality engineering is also important on signing off on most documents. And for us, management is more, it's really the client. So we have the clients also sign off on documents. But I believe if you're doing this all within your own company, a lot of them, except for maybe some of the detailed design ones, and maybe like test reports, they would be signed off with some level of management.
Right, yeah. So I mean, I think it's an important point. You know, since we're a design consultant company, we do the designs kind of in parallel with our clients, who are usually the medical device companies. That also kind of enforces those processes, because we have to, as part of our checkpoints back to our clients, make sure that those are being documented in our quality system. So it adds that other kind of level of accountability.
Great, good point. Any other questions? I just want to say thank you to Katie and Dorota for doing this really informative lunch and learn today. It was a lot of really great information. We appreciate it. And we appreciate Simplexity for sponsoring today as well. Yeah. And we wanted to let everyone know that we will send out a recording and the slides tomorrow for this lunch and learn, so you can share it with other people or take a look at it again yourself. And the links that are on the screen will also be included in the slides.
All right, thank you. Thank you all for attending as well.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for supporting the Oregon Bioscience Incubator, and have a great rest of your week.